All right.
Wow.
Wow.
Got to approve.
Right, Sean, are you still with us, Sean?
I'm still here, Greg. I'm sitting here patiently in anticipation.
Right. Well, your moment is here. Right. So I've been trawling the internet and looking for some pictures of things, and I've got some pictures of Sean, and hopefully they're going to prompt some conversation and things. So I suppose my first conversation to Sean is picture on the top left there was taken in 1973 at Norfolk Park and that's where I met Sean, and Sean taught me and many other people how to fly model aeroplanes. We were very lucky as a club to have three people who were fantastic pilots. The guy in that photo, who Sean and I were talking about, Joe Franco, who was Polish, we had Sean, and we had a guy called John Palmer. And if anyone's done any para aerobatics or been to the shows, they'll know that John Palmer has been a prodigious pilot through the year. So that club had sort of three really good guys that were teaching people to fly. So I just wanted to my first question to you, Sean, is when did you start flying? How did you get into it? Obviously when I met you there, you were a grown man, but I think you started flying when you were quite young.
Yes, that's correct, Greg. My introduction to flying was probably as a 5-year-old. My father came home with a scale model of a Liberator, although I didn't recognise it as such at the time. And I immediately took it out into the back garden and threw it, and I was most disappointed it didn't fly. I don't think my father was very impressed, but anyhow. And then roll on a few years when Airfix first of all started as a young lad. I guess this would have been in the mid-50s. I was probably about 8-10 years old. I noticed the Airfix models in Woolworths, and there was a Spitfire and a Hurricane, and I bought them both and made them. But again, I wasn't very impressed that they didn't fly. And then finally, I went into a shop in North Harrow, a general newsagents who also did a bit of model stuff. And I purchased a Keelcraft sedan, which was an 18-inch wingspan, all-sheet rubber-powered model. And I was then into flying. I then bought another model in the same series. I think it was called a Rapier. And I went upstairs to my bedroom and threw it into the back garden, and it didn't go very far. So I don't know why I did it, but I made some cardboard tabs on the wings to give the wings a bit more camber, as I now know it, and tried it again, and it worked a little bit better. And I think that underlined the fact that by nature, I always wanted to improve things. I think an employer would say I was outcome orientated, and I'd put my hands up straight away. Not only outcome orientated, but also performance orientated. Some people have said that you just want to win, Sean. Well, no, it was more subtle than that. And if I could improve performance, then if I was competing, I'd probably get a better result. So that's a little bit of an introduction. I'll go on a little bit. I then went in and did some control line, and a friend of mine down the road, a couple of years older than me, took me over to Norfolk Park with my first control line model, which was called a DC Bite. It was an all-sheet construction. It had a DC Merlin in it. It came as a complete package. And my friend Paul Healy said that he would fly it, hold me, give me the handle, and then I could have a go. And I was flying around, it was okay. And then the second flight, I actually went right the way through the flight. And I think very much to Paul's relief, I was then solo, and I continued and joined the Kenton Club, which basically did control line combat with Oliver Tigers. There's a chappie called George Copeman who's famously tuned those. I was a sprog at the time, but it was very inspirational to fly with all those people. So shall I put a punctuation in there, Greg, because I'm wittering away rather?
No, we don't want to hear me talking. They want to hear you talking, Sean. So
yes.
I don't want to say very much. Where did the Kenton Club fly then? Did they fly in Kenton Park?
No, they actually flew at Norfolk Park. And it's the area that's now occupied by the mini golf course. And it was between the hospital and the main large field at Norfolk Park, shielded by trees on both sides. And there was quite a lively club there. We had a club secretary who used to make all-sheet trainers and teach people how to fly. Used to fly there on Sunday afternoons. And I continued doing that for a little while, and I even branched out a little bit into free flight. I did an own design A1. I built a Killcraft Caprice, but I didn't build it from the kit. Somebody had a plan. I think it was a fellow called Peter Scott, who was a little bit older than me, and he was quite clever, and he was very influential. And the interesting thing was about that, and I think this was Peter's design, instead of making the fuselage with 16th bolts as sides, we made a Warren girder fuselage with 8 square sprue stringers in the 4 corners, and then 8 by 16 diagonal spacers to form a Warren girder fuselage. It was very, very stiff and very light. The only drawback was that you had to cover it, but that wasn't a problem. And then soon after that, I drifted away from the sport and became involved with cycle racing.
So how old were you at that point, Sean?
I think by then I was, let's think, I would have been about 15, 16. So I'd started to grow up a little bit. But as my kid sister said to me many years ago, she said, Sean, you'll never grow up. And fortunately, so far, she's been absolutely right.
So you got into cycling?
I then got into cycling, and with the performance thing and the outcome thing, all, if you like, examples of obsessive behaviour, which can be very damaging. But later on in my cycling career, or my second cycling career, I actually became involved with coaching. And I always look for that streak of obsessive behaviour, which signaled to me that the person who was involved really wanted to do it. But I also realised that that would be a little bit of a challenge to effectively focus that obsessive behaviour. But I'm jumping forward too long. So I started cycling when I was about 15 or 16, carried on till I was about 25. And I retired from cycle racing and became re-engaged with model flying. And in the intervening time, the sport had changed quite a bit. I did know that there was a club at Northwick Park, or a group of flyers, and I used to go to the Wembley Park model shop with a chappie called Brian Smith, who acquainted me with radio control, and I bought a single channel with a wind-up escapement, designed a glider, open structure with a T-tail. In fact, it jammed and it flew away, but it was retrieved a few weeks later. I continued to build and design models, and I'd read in one of the magazines about thermal soaring. And I then put together the very first of the algebra series, which was 8-foot wingspan, open structure wing, although it did have a sheeted top surface leading edge, plywood fuselage, V-tail, and a Cox 049 on the front of it to launch it. And I took that over to my local park, Headstone Manor Recreation Ground, one day, flew the model, and the motor ran out of juice, and I was then gliding. And for the first time, I found a thermal. I'd only read about them. So I thought, oh, that's good. So I started circling and watching the model closely, and I sort of centered in the thermal, and it was climbing away quite nicely, as they do, but it also went downwind with the thermal. So I thought, although I was quite high, I better come back. I don't want to get caught out too far downwind. So I flew back to the top of the field, flew slightly in front of myself, and picked up a second thermal. And then in the same flight, did the same thing over again. And that was the end of that. I then decided that the wing perhaps wasn't strong and rigid enough, so I looked into building a model with a fully sheeted wing, have a little bit of a background in structural engineering, and looking at the structure, I didn't really see the point of putting a traditional spar in the wing. If it was fully sheeted, I felt the structural approach would be to put shear webs and use the top and bottom sheets as the top and bottom flanges of a beam. And that's the model that's illustrated to the right of the top right of the pictures you have there. And then to the left, I also did a slightly stretched version of it, which I flew in the early days of the F3B Nationals with some success as well. And the picture on the right was actually another component of the sport I became involved with, which was cross-country flying, and that was at Crook Peak.
I was going to ask you whether you knew where that was, but it's Crook Peak, correct? Yeah.
It's Crook Peak, and I flew quite well, but I didn't fully understand the rules. And although I got to the fly-off and got round first, I was disqualified because I didn't realise you actually had to be at the turn point as your model made the turn. I was a few feet short of it. But anyway, lesson learned.
But cross-country flying sort of suited you because you were very fit from cycling. I'm not, and your running was pretty good, wasn't it? So you were, not only could you fly really well and you had a plane that had, as you say, maybe because of your design abilities, you designed something which had superior performance to other people's planes. You could run faster than a lot of the people that were in it.
Yes, I think you've summed that up very well, Greg. They're the basic components of cross-country flying as it was at that time, but the world has moved on a tremendous amount, and I'm amazed at the way cross-country or distance task flying has evolved and made possible, I think, by the huge technical advances, not only with the radio gear, but with telemetry, reliability, etc., etc. So then perhaps we come to the bottom left picture, and that was my first streamline fuselage algebra. The fuselage was actually a cooperation with a fellow called Clive Hall, who approached me and said if I was thinking of doing a fiberglass fuselage, he'd be pleased to mould it for me. And after a little bit of discussion and a little bit of advice from Clive, I produced a plug based on a lot of advice Clive had given me. He was quite delighted with that, and he started moulding fuselages. So we'd gone from a box plywood fuselage of minimal cross-section with rubber bands holding the wings to a much more streamlined and efficient design. And I was also aware of the fact that in glider performance, yes, there is endurance, but there's also glide angle. And I think there's a bit of a trade-off between the two. If you're thermal soaring, if you've got a model that's got a good glide angle and can fly quite fast efficiently, you would increase your chances of finding a thermal and therefore getting a good result. So that basically summarizes that. And then it moved on and we moved towards F3B. I flew in, I think, one of the first meetings in the UK at Halton, and probably with one of the models that is top centre in the pictures there. And I think I was fifth in that competition. And I was a new boy, and I don't think it went down very well in some quarters because I hadn't trod the expected path of using an existing or established design. I'd done my own design, but it did work quite well. I think I was eventually accepted in that respect. And then going to the bottom centre picture, I didn't want to put spoilers in the wing because it would be quite a difficult challenge. So I'd seen the Seatard brothers with a canopy brake on their model, very small, but my glider fortunately had quite a big canopy. So I constructed a canopy air brake. But one of the drawbacks of that was that if you were doing an F3B speed task and you hit a bit of turbulence and the canopy opened a little bit, it would open a long way, probably get ripped off the model. And although that never happened to me, what I did do, I put a baby servo in there, and having closed the canopy, I would then lock the canopy in the down position, so that wouldn't happen. I also...
Can I ask you some question? Can I ask you a question at this point? Because it's quite interesting in terms of your philosophy. You look at your planes, you've got the swept wings. You know, where did you get your understanding of aerodynamics? You know, what sections, you know, we talked about Epler and things. You know, what took you along this process of the swept wing and the sort of configuration of model? And, you know, the blue fuselage is the Algebra 8. So, you know, there were quite a lot of iterations. How did you develop those skills and understanding of aerodynamics, etc.?
Right. Well, I was quite an avid reader of the two main magazines, Radio Modeler and RCM&E, at that time. And I think I listened information from them about airfoil sections, and then tapped into the Epler sections, which you mentioned earlier on. And the sweep back is quite an interesting one. When I was starting, there was the Graupner Cumulus, and I remember you flying one of those, and I noticed that had swept wings. And my rationale was that if I swept the wing of my glider, the nose would be much shorter, and then the cross-sectional area, which needed to carry a receiver, a battery, and a few servos, would be at a maximum at that point, but then you could very quickly make the fuselage a lot narrower. And I reckon that would mean that there would be less drag. But I did find when I started to fly those models, if I flew them fast, they did have a lot of directional stability. And as I like to occasionally fly fast, I found that quite handy and quite useful. And I didn't actually find any disadvantage. 9.3, which was a very versatile section. And one of the interesting things was, even though it was slightly undercambered, it still went fast. And you could load it up and it would still go very fast. And apparently, looking at the polar for that section, and it was actually Clive Hall who did my fuselages, who pointed out that if you were flying that section fast in a positive lift situation, the drag was very low. But if you hit some turbulence and went into a negative lift situation, the drag would come in very, very quickly. Anyhow, I did persevere with the undercamber, and on my stretch version, the Glass Elephant, which I think went up to 15 or 16 feet span, I actually used an Epler 392, which is very, very similar to the 193, but slightly better as an endurance section. And of course, it did fit the fuselage very handily. I hope that's answered the questions that you just posed, Greg.
Brilliant. No, thank you. Is there anything you want to say that I mean, the pictures are prompting you really nicely, because, you know, Sean hasn't seen these pictures. This is a surprise for him, what I'm putting up. So he's doing really, really well. I'll move on to the next slide. But so the Algebra 8 was the model that you sort of got to that point where you had that construction. And then was the White Elephant a cross-country model or an F3B model? What did you develop the White Elephant for?
Right, well, there were two elephants, actually. There was a White Elephant and a Glass Elephant. And the White Elephant came first, and it was an endeavour to make a more competitive F3B model. And I did a bit of pioneering work with variable camber, with putting servos in the wings, which in those days was very unusual. And it was about 12-foot wingspan. But it was a bit of a handful in the speed task and to some degree the distance task in F3B, although it was okay in the duration class. So as it was a little bit of a failure in that respect, I just called it a white elephant as it was white in colour. But it was also quite handy in cross-country events where I used it at Crook Peak at Malvern. But then moving on, the glass elephant was actually a continuation of the elephant name, and I called that model a glass elephant because it was a stretched algebra. So it was a big algebra, if you like, hence the use of the term elephant in there.
Okay. So I'm going to put the next slide up. And the first slide in the top left-hand corner is obviously a British team. So do you want to talk a little bit about how many World Championships you went to, how you did? Because there'll be some people on here tonight, there'll be a number of people who know how you did, but I think there'll be a lot of people who don't realise how many World Championships you went to and how you did.
Okay, well yes, that's quite a nice picture. Top left, there's myself on the left there with my variable camber plywood fuselage algebra, and it was in South Africa in '77. In the middle is Neville Mattingly with his own design. I can't remember the name of his design. And on the right there was Tony O'Shea from the High Wycombe Club with an EMP Halton Special variation. And of course, on the right-hand side was Jim Andrews, who was our team manager at that time. And Jim was a great bloke. He was a mate, but he was also a very, very effective team manager. And he was also very sensitive to other people. And one of the things I remember was at the end of the penultimate day, we'd gone back to the hotel and we'd eaten. And I was actually sharing with Jim, and we were chatting away. And I became a bit heavy-eyed, and Jim just said to me, he said, "Oh, Sean, I think perhaps you're ready to go to sleep," which I was, which I did. And I thought that was rather special. And I think Jim has been involved with BMFA over many years in senior roles. And I do occasionally bump into him and have a chat about the past. Anyway, that was '77 in Pretoria, South Africa. And I actually still occasionally talk with Nord Guernica, who was a South African. And if the phone rings at 5 o'clock in the morning, I know it's Nord ringing from Pretoria to have a chit chat. And then '77, then '79, we had the World Championship in Belgium. I think it was a place called Amay, which was on the river. Well, I think we Brits pronounce it Meuse, but I believe the Belgians pronounce it Mars. Yeah. And then it came to the UK. I think that was '83. But in '81, we went to the States, and it was in California, in Sacramento. And I didn't actually win that, but I did get bronze and silver medals in a couple of those championships, although on one occasion we did actually win the team prize.
But you should have won in them. They did a Lewis Hamilton on you. You should have won in America, but the Americans, typical way, cheated, didn't they?
Well,
sorry, they bent the rules.
Yes. I'll expand on that a little bit. The American team manager was Dan Pruss, who I also got on well with. He was a 747 captain. And the American team leader, a chappie called Dwight Holly, didn't quite get a max in the distance task. And Dan managed to bully the jury into allowing him to have a refly. And on the refly, he actually did get a max, and that made the difference. That put me down into second place. Having said that, I think Dwight was a little bit embarrassed, and I actually got on very well with him. And he did come to the UK on one occasion, and he stayed with us. And But that was quite good. An interesting story about Dwight was, his name was Dwight Holly, and he met and married a woman called Holly. So his wife was Holly Holly. Anyhow, let's go on. As you probably know, sorry, Greg.
No, go on, you go, you go.
As you probably know, I didn't just do gliding. I did a little bit of pylon racing, FAI pylon racing. I did a little bit of FAI aerobatics, and I did regularly fly power models, sometimes small, quite twitchy and quite fast. And I'm convinced that I had the benefit of cross-fertilization between the different components of the sport. And the skills I developed flying those models certainly made me a more skilled glider pilot. And I remember on one occasion, I was flying my White Elephant, and it was in the Nationals. And I think it was in the fly-off, and things were tight. And I was coming into land, and I was coming in 10 seconds too low. So I put the spoilers in, did a 360-degree turn, back on course, landed the model, and then just after I'd landed the model on the spot, the bell went for the end of the slot. And I think if I didn't have the experience of flying fast, twitchy power models, I probably wouldn't have been able to do that. So that's going off at a little bit of a tangent. Then bottom left and middle left was an aerobatic slope soarer I put together. It's called a Seychelles. It was actually published as a plan by RCM, and through the FAI pylon racing, I'd become aware of the shape of a laminar flow airfoil section, or a so-called laminar flow airfoil section, which had quite a sharp leading edge. Camber was well back, probably 45%. So I thought, I'm going to try that on my glider, and people scoffed, etc. But in fact, it worked very, very well. And that model was not only very, very slippery as a result of that section, the bonus at the other end was it was also very forgiving at low speed. So you could come in very nose high on the slope without any risk of a stall, and it would just gently settle down. So that section worked very well. And that was an all-round plus, if you like.
That picture on the left of the Seychelles is actually, again, that's at Crook Peak, and we went down to a pylon race, and you got in the final of the pylon race with it, much to the disbelief of the other guys who were all making purpose-made, all had purpose-made pylon races, and they were really heavy. They were 8, 9, 10 pounds. We used to fly, up to the maximum weight in those days was 11 pounds, and I think you got third that day in the final, and that was an aerobatic plane, really, a slope aerobatic plane, and you were flying against people who had bespoke pylon racing models. It was a great plane. It flew really, really well.
Well, thanks for reminding me about that, Greg. Yeah, and I think the middle shot was at Ivinghoe Beacon, and I think that shot was taken by Tony Shortell, who was one of the mentors at Norfolk Park, who very sadly passed away, as you know, a few months ago. And he really was an incredible man, and he'd flown all sorts of full-size aeroplanes, as well as looking after the youngsters who were flying at Norfolk Park. And then the model bottom right is perhaps a sport aerobatic plane, and it had a 2.5cc Super Tiger up front on a 7.6 prop, flying with a bit of nitro, and it was called Zippy because, being small, it did go quite fast. But I actually flew that in a couple of aerobatic competitions against the 60-powered models, and I think I was probably something like 10th in those events. And certainly it did create a little bit of interest. And it was Tony Dowdswell, who was the editor of RCM&E, who said he wanted to publish it as a plan, and it was him who actually named it as Zippy, because it zipped here and it zipped there, as he understood it. And as I wasn't very good on planes, I was happy.
What that photo doesn't show, sadly, is it was covered in an absolutely amazing coloured nylon that you'd found. It was almost psychedelic, and it was so vivid, the colour on it. It really showed up in the sky, didn't it? It was a beautiful aeroplane. What I want to do is obviously I'll ask you a few more questions, and then I'd like to sort of open it up to the guys that are here. So you sort of stopped flying. One of the things you've always been incredibly humble about your achievements. So it's really great for you to talk sort of openly about it tonight. So you gave up cycling when you were 25. I mean, do you just want to quickly sort of say, some people will know, some people will know, but you sort of got to a similar level at cycling as you did to your flying. I mean, when you finished at 25, what sort of achievements had you got in your cycling? And then obviously you went back, you gave up flying and you went back into cycling and you started competing again. So do you want to just give us a little bit of background around that before you talk about what you've been doing when you came back into flying?
Okay, well, certainly both the model flying and cycling have been passions, if you like, throughout my life, and it's been great that both of those sports have a very large social component to them. Anyhow, in my first cycling career as a youngster, I did get a couple of national titles. I didn't quite make World Championship or Olympic selections. And after a few years, I realised that I wasn't really going to make a career out of cycle racing. So I retired at the ripe old age of 25, and as you know, came back into model flying as we've been talking. My second model flying career came to a halt. I think I would describe it as I ran out of steam. And I stopped flying, and I did a little bit of running, got injured, went for treatment, bumped into an old cycling mate who said, "Why don't you come out for a ride with us all on New Year's Day?" And I did, and found that because I'd been doing some running, I was quite fit. And I was then back into cycling, but as a veteran. And I rode for many years as a veteran, and I think during that period I did actually pick up, I haven't actually listed them all, but probably about 20 national veterans titles and a world title as well. And I also became involved with coaching. I had been an instructor and examiner in model flying. People used to ask me to teach them to fly, which I was happy to do. And I got involved with cycling as a coach, and I actually got involved with the Federation in preparing the coach's manual. And as part of that process, I became a coach tutor. And I did work with various cyclists, asked me to help them in various different roles. And I was privileged to work with 4 cyclists, Olympic medalists, gold medalists in different roles earlier on in their career. And I still keep in contact with those riders from time to time. So it was quite a privilege to be involved with talent. And of course, again, it was all outcome orientated. And one of the interesting things I used to do is when I started with a new rider who would ask me to coach them, and I would ask them the question, right, we'll have a meeting in a couple of weeks' time, but I want you to tell me what you want out of cycling, which is deliberately a very open question. And I would get a range of responses to that, and it would give me a valuable insight into how they were thinking, ranging from one particular rider who went through a total process in quite a lot of detail, but no outcome. And then another rider who not only went through a process, but came across with the outcomes he wanted to achieve in his career in a progressive way. And clearly he was very talented because he achieved quite a lot. He became an Olympic champion, and he was the first Englishman to win the Tour de France. So that was in my cycling career. And then I unfortunately had a bit of a run-in with cancer, which stopped my cycling. And although there are legacies from that, I am cancer-free now. And having stopped cycling, I was kicking my heels a bit, and I thought, well, I might do a bit of model flying. So I went over to see David Wiltshire in Watford and bought a ready-to-go foamy, and I was hooked again. And I've been flying ever since then. That's about 5 years ago. I don't have the inclination now to build models, so I do take the easy way out, but I still do love flying. And I've got a couple, they're all electric models, but I've got a couple of aerobatic models, etc. Oh, and there's a funny story there. I have a model called a Heron, which is, I think, 2.4 meters wingspan foamy. It's got a motor to get it up there. And I was flying at the local flying field, and a few of the other lads were there, but they're all glass aeroplanes. And I found a thermal and I got away, and I'm climbing away. And one of the other pilots said to me, have you got telemetry on there? And I said, no. And then there was a bit of a pregnant silence. And they said, well, how did you get up there? And my mischievous nature got the better of me. And I looked up in the sky, and just at that moment, an airliner went across at altitude. And I said, oh, I noticed that airliner in a thermal, so I just followed it. So that's a little bit of a mischievous joke. And on this journey, I became very acquainted with you, first of all, through cycling, because you became interested in cycling, and we rode a little bit. And it's interesting to see the parallels of being strongly outcome orientated, as you clearly are, Greg. And I commend you on what you do. Not only are you outcome orientated strongly with your sporting performances, but you also are very involved with the administrative side of our sport, and you're not scared to bring your talents to the table, as it were, in that respect. So there.
Thank you, Sean. As I said earlier, with actually all the stuff we do, BARCS and BMFA, I'm really lucky. I've got Nick, Peter Allen, Pete Mitchell, all these other people around me who they know a lot about what they're talking, and I think we come up with some really good stuff. And BARCS and the BMFA, it's moved forward a lot, and it's a much happier place than it used to be. When I look at some of that picture in the top left and some of the friction that was going on in the 70s in model gliding. Shall we throw Sean, that's been brilliant and insightful, and it's exactly, I didn't need to ask you any questions. I think you just mapped it out absolutely brilliantly. Shall we throw it open with the guys like to ask Sean some questions?
I don't have any questions particularly, but just to say thanks, because I remember you and your exploits in my early days. I remember seeing you fly Alpina inverted around at Filey Brig Bay, which impressed me no end. So I bought one. I never managed to do that, but it was a good plane. But the one thing that I did copy from you, I think it was published, otherwise I wouldn't have seen it. But you figured out how to make a variable pot on the transmitter and move to fixed places, and you called it your get your home switch, and it altered the elevator on your glider so that if you wanted to get a bit more speed, you just click the switch and you've got a bit of down elevator. I always remember that, and I got me out of trouble a number of times.
Oh, wow, Peter, that does bring back some memories. And I do remember the 3-position switch, basically evolved for F3B, the duration mode, the distance mode with a very small amount of down elevator, and then for speed, a lot more down elevator, so that when you completed your dive and you're flying along the course, it wouldn't want to bury its nose in the clouds. And I was flying Skyleader equipment at the time, and I had a chat with Stuart Ewins about that concept, and he says, yes, we can do that. And he very kindly did that. And that was good fun at Filey Brig. And I was a little bit mischievous there, because I can remember on one occasion we were flying from Filey Brig, and there was a smooth beach in front of where we were flying, a wide, smooth beach. And it was a sunny day, and I'm looking down there and I could see the shadow of the Alpina. And in the end, I dived down with the Alpina, and I could see the model and the shadow converging. And I actually managed just to slide it along the beach, and with the speed, get up again, get back into slope lift, and get back up to the top of the hill. And I did that on a few occasions. And I then went back to the camp, and I did hear a few of the other lads also tried that, but they had to go down to the bottom of the hill to retrieve their models.
I remember it well.
You're bringing out the worst side in me now, Peter, but thank you very much for those great memories.
Yes, I do remember that well. We had some really hairy nights after that. Very good. But that switch, I'd forgotten it was three positions, but I can only ever remember using it as the get me home switch. And it was really, that was an amazing thing. I fiddled about and put it on a Futaba transmitter, but it did work very well.
Well, it's a precursor to flight modes, isn't it? To flight model memories.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, incredible. Anybody else like to ask? Sorry, go on. Sorry,
yeah.
Pete, go on. Sorry, Pete, go on.
No, I say it was back in the olden days when everything was analog and you couldn't measure anything. You just looked at it, and if that was right, it worked. Yeah.
Sean, you must have known Pete Freebury.
I did.
Yeah. He, of course, and the Kenton Club used to come around to, I live in Kent, to Ramsgate and Ashford. And of course, they were the top-notch combat club. Did you ever fly combat?
Yes, with the Kenton Club, and Peter was with the Northwood Club.
Oh,
and
right.
They were only just up the road from Kenton, and we always got on very well with each other, and we go to events together, sometimes visit each other's fields. And I mean, names from that time, there was Peter Tribe, I think he was national champion in combat, and Pete Freebury used to fly combat. And in fact, Peter became quite an accomplished free flight modeler as well, I believe. And I did have some conversations with him in more recent days, but that was still a long time ago now. But no, certainly I remember that, and both the Northwood and Kenton clubs were almost synonymous.
Yeah, it was, of course, I think the Oliver Tiger versus the Rivers Silver Streak. But moving on from that, back to gliding, tell me about, before the Seychelles, there was an algebra aerobatic. And I never knew about this until 2 days ago. What can you tell me about that?
Okay, well, I developed a 2-meter algebra rudder elevator, which was intended as an intro class. And I put an Epler, I think it was a 184, a slightly thinner section on it. And it had a standard fiberglass fuselage. And in fact, it went quite well. I did actually win a round of the F3B League with it, which didn't go down very well with the other lads who had their specialist models there. But anyway, putting that to one side, I was then encouraged to make an aerobatic version of that, which I did. And this was in cooperation with Dick Edmonds. And I made some semi-symmetrical wings, plugged those into it, and that used to go okay as a general sport aerobatic model. And then Dick said, well, can we kit that? But we need a fiberglass fuselage. And I agreed with him, and I didn't have time to actually prepare a plug. But there was a character on the scene at the time. His first name was Ken, and he flew with the Fairlock Club. He lives in Spain now. Sorry?
That was Ken Hansen.
That's it.
Yeah.
Ken Hansen, that's right. It was quite a character. Anyway, he very kindly produced a plug. I spoke with Clive Hall, and Clive was prepared to mould the fuselages for Dick. And more latterly, his son, John Hall, took over that side of things. Incidentally, John phoned up out of the blue a few weeks ago after about 40 years, but that's another story. Anyhow, the algebra developed, the aerobatic algebra developed like that. And again, I think it's all been driven by perhaps performance. Although it was a sport model, it was pretty aerobatic. And I think I flew it once at Sandown Park in the symposium. Winch launched it with loads of lead on board, went up to the end, and then came down in a dive and came very low and very fast past the flight line. Now, I think with Dave Bishop wanting me to talk into his loudspeaker while I was flying. So yes, there was an aerobatic algebra. And in fact, Dick did quite a lot of development based on that fuselage, and he actually increased the span and made some thermal soarers up to, I think, a wingspan of about 4 meters. But at that time, Dick was doing that of his own initiative. I drifted away from model flying.
Going on, in the last week, it's either on the BMFA site, I don't think it's on the BARCS site, one was for sale, and I've never, ever heard of that model before. So it's interesting you're talking about it. It wasn't like a 1 week job where it was built and flew and forgotten about. The next thing is, Sean, I remember coming across you, we never spoke. I was towing for a guy called Ron Gardner from the Thanet Club that I used to belong to at the Nationals, and it was in the 80s. I think I was living abroad at the time and came back, and I was a good tower because, unlike you, well, I wasn't that fit, but I was in those days as slim as you. And after Ron had got off the line, there was this voice. I looked round and you'd hooked a thermal, as you do, and somebody decided to follow you. And your reaction was, I'll say it straight away, off, go find your own thermal. So at that stage, I realized you were very competitive. Is that the sort of thing you used to do?
I don't remember saying that. I may have said that. I only normally address people like that if they really annoy me. But
well, it wasn't me, so maybe somebody really annoyed you.
I probably said it tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
But I do remember an occasion at the Nationals, and I was flying my Glass Elephant in the thermal event, and I was flying in the same slot as Chris Foss, and I was flying a long way away, so I had a good reference on the horizon, and I was getting a bit of a move on because the air where I wasn't particularly good, but I instinctively felt there was some good air a little bit further on, which there was in fact. But what was interesting, talking about people following me, Chris Foss was flying and he had his high phase and he started to follow me. And to keep up with me, he was having to dive quite a bit. And all that happened was he got lower and lower and lower. And I just kept going. that again, that sounds a little bit arrogant, but I think there is a little bit of a competitive animal in there. But having said that, it's an example of, as I was saying earlier on, obsessive behaviour.
Good.
But thank you very much, Ian, for those great memories. Yeah, especially on the basis, the older we get, the better we were.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I actually now think that I wasn't as good as I thought I was.
Sean, I think the F3B competition you won with your 2 metre model was probably the Detling event, which was almost like an exhibition event. That was my first ever F3B event, and also an inspiration to go off and start glass fibering wings, because your 2 metre model had the sort of like a matte finish it looked, but it was glass fibre that was sort of sanded down. But that 2 metre model flew really well. And I think, as you say, there was a few people with algebraics. I think it was either Dave Woods or his brother was there with an 8. And there was probably some other models there as well. I don't think Nick Wright was there. But yeah, that was my first F3B event. I missed F3B for a while and eventually came back into it in the 90s. But I just want to say, I mean, seeing some of the photographs that have been put up, it's sad to say I remember a lot of those from reading the magazines back in the 70s and 80s. There's a lot of inspirational models there. I was certainly hugely inspired by your models and the extent of different types of flying that you did, power and gliding and all sorts of things. And when I first started at work in the 70s, I went out one lunch break and there was a guy flying a model with a V-tail out in a field alongside the works. And I went over and had a word with him, and it was one of your early plywood algebras, like in some of the early photos that were shown. And I was absolutely blown away, because most of the models I'd seen, most of the gliders I'd seen up to that time, were these very floaty, almost guided free flight things. So huge inspiration, lovely design. You've always had an incredible flair for design. So I just want to say thanks for all the inspiration, because you've been hugely inspirational across the years in terms of what you've done. So thanks, and congratulations on the president.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks very much for saying that. And yes, you have jogged my memory. I think it was certainly in Kent, so it probably was at Detling. And interestingly, I actually still have that model, and I've flown it a couple of times at Ivinghoe Beacon, and we had an Ivinghoe Soaring Association visit up to Buckminster, and I actually flew it up there as well. It's still in reasonably good condition. Yeah, and you referred to the wings, and I always finished my wings in that manner. And although it's a slightly rough surface, they seem to go all right. And I think if I was an aerodynamic snob, I would have said, well, it just energizes the boundary layer. But I see at the bottom of the picture now we have an A2 world champion who's listening very patiently and very tolerantly. Hello there, Mike.
Good evening, sir.
There's no need to be obsequious. Nice to see you.
Yes, nice to see you. I remember meeting you at the Model Engineer exhibition last time we had one.
Yes, yeah.
And when you were talking about your running skill and cross-country flying, do you remember a meeting at Butser where they insisted that you were not allowed to run and you had to walk, and you had to do that sort of Olympic fast walking thing and try and fly an airplane at the same time? It was hilarious.
I do remember that, and I think that was a response to a situation where clearly I could run fairly effectively, but a lot of model flyers weren't able to do that. So they decided you mustn't run, you must walk, as you just described. But being fairly fit, I think I could walk faster than most other model flyers as well. So it was counterproductive in the end.
And in the fly-off, you were walking neck and neck with the other guy that was up against you. It was hilarious. Never laughed so much. It's very, very funny.
Thanks for that, Mike.
Yeah, well, thank you for your talk. It was excellent.
If I could just echo Simon's comment there, Sean, I was a power flyer up until the mid-80s, and I went to the exhibition and flying and whatever it was at Sywell in the mid-80s. And that was the first time I ever saw a model glider fly. And it was you going up a winch with the algebra and then doing square loops and coming on the low leg at about 5 feet off the deck at what seemed like about 100 miles an hour. And I just didn't know that gliders could do that. And that's what inspired me to get into gliding. And now I probably fly gliders in a ratio to power models of about 10 times glider flying to 1 times power flight. So thank you for that inspiration. It was quite a revelation at the time.
Well, thanks for that, John. No, certainly gliders, as you know, can be a lot of fun. And I think if you're at an air show, it's rather boring if you just circle around and find a thermal, so you need perhaps to do something a little bit exciting. And I can go through it in order. I mentioned David Bishop earlier on, and I can remember that I would launch my model with my left hand, have my transmitter in my right hand, and then one foot would be on the pedal to work the winch. So I'm coordinating 3 things there. And then on top of that, Dave Bishop wants to talk to me, and he wants me to say what I'm doing, which was a bit of a challenge, and I enjoyed it. But no, I'm pleased that it actually inspired you. Thank you very much for that. I feel very humble at times. In fact, I felt quite humble throughout this chit chat. Although it's great to talk about things and a bit of nostalgia, but they do say nostalgia ain't what it used to be. But anyhow, I can see Mike nodding there. But no, thank you for that, John. And yeah, that's given me a good feeling. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Well, on the point of nostalgia, we every year we have the Pete Beadle Nostalgia Day up at Ivinghoe, and I think that picture on the top right is you and Dave with some nostalgic planes, and we had a fantastic event this year at Ivinghoe. It was pure west and it was warm, and there were a number of algebras flying, and I would disagree with you, Sean. I think nostalgia is very much alive and going well with the algebra sort of lineage, if you like. A lot of people have still got really good algebras and they fly really well. So I think even today it's a plane that's got a legacy. And I think John Whitten put a really nice post up on the chat. I don't know if everyone's read it, but it says it all really about what you said tonight, which is, you were. I'll read it out to you. He says, you probably haven't seen it, Sean, because you've been talking. He says, a really insightful and interesting discussion with Sean. My memory of Sean was flying off of the White Elephant on the south face of Ivinghoe. It spurred me into sport and competition flying. I now work as an aircraft designer, especially in R&D type planes and electric vertical takeoff and landing. Many thanks to Sean. He inspired many people to do things and fly better. I think that says it all, and it says how you've been tonight. It's been really insightful and brilliant. I think, thank you so much for one, agreeing to be the BARCS president, and I think we all feel very grateful to be able to offer you that. And secondly, thank you for accepting it and doing this presentation tonight. It's been brilliant.
Well, thank you very much, Greg and gents, for being so kind and encouraging. I did discuss becoming president with Greg a bit because I'm not very active model flying at the moment. So the reality is that you may not see very much of me, but I do feel very welcome, and you'll probably see me popping up occasionally during the year, saying hello and chewing the cud, as we say.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, big round of applause.
Yes, well done.
Brilliant. So we just got 2 little bits of business, really. One is just to say, next year's meeting will be on the 10th of December, so we'll get the notice out on that early for next year. And then the other thing is just have any AOB. So has anyone got any AOB they want to bring up at this point? John, fire away.
Couple actually. I don't know if you you may or may not be aware, but the F3 RES class has just been accepted as an FAI provisional class for next year in 22.
Yeah.
Are there going to be any plans for BARCS to put anything on at the nationals in terms of that specific class?
Really good question. So there's several things there. There's two events where we can offer space to the guys that run that class. That's Radio Glide and the Nationals. Now, it's not for BARCS to actually turn around and say what the agenda of the Nationals is. It's the SFTC. But what's, I think, you know, we alluded to it earlier, what's really good is a lot of the guys that are on this call tonight who are on the BARCS committee are also on the SFTC. So it's very much something that we really want to do is to promote classes like this. So if there's a will from the people that do the doing, there's a couple of guys who've taken over from Andy Sefton to run F3K Res, or the new version of it, named slightly different, I can't quite remember. If they want to do something in conjunction with us at Radio Glide and at the Nationals, they're really, really welcome.
Okay, I'll get the message through to them then, because they live in Shrewsbury around the corner from me. And the second question was, would BARCS be prepared to fund, say, 4 or 6 bungees for that particular non-electric power launched class? As you have mentioned, your finances are healthy and you're quite happy to use them for competition equipment. One of the things that those guys are actually short of is some bungees. Just, I think they're about 50 quid each, so a couple £100, that sort of thing. Would that be something that BARCS would consider funding for? I think
we'd definitely have a conversation about it, and I think we'd probably want to have a conversation in conjunction with someone like Neil at Hyperflight, who brings them in, and you know, we're going to do them, then he'll get some advertising out of it, and we'd expect him to do them at trade price and things. So let's have a debate about it. Absolutely.
Okay, I'll mention that I've asked a question and they want to debate, or you want to debate, and I'll get the guys to contact you.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, good, really good. Anybody else with any AOB?
No.
So I've gone. Sorry, there's a.
Yeah, sorry, Greg. Yeah, one thing. Just seeing Ian's league sheet earlier on, or just reading it before we came on here. We've got a lot of members now flying slope soaring models, and there's slope soaring competitions and so on, but we don't have a BARCS league for slope soaring of any sort. So I wonder if that's something worth pursuing. Get those guys involved.
It's a really interesting point, Pete. I mean, I suppose the only real competitive class now in slope soaring is F3F. 60-inch pylon racing, and then 60-inch pylon racing sort of died out, which is a shame because both of them were fantastic spectacles and brilliant to partake in, but they're just, there's no appetite. So the only real competitive flying that's done is F3F, and that's run by the Great British Slope Soaring Association, and they run a league, winter league and a summer league, and they're really good at it, and they're a specialist body. I would like to say, yeah, there is absolutely something we could do with those guys, but I think also conversely, they're really good at it, and they've got it absolutely off pat. You know, it's perfect what they do. It's very, very well organised. Yeah. So, you know, something perhaps we can discuss, but I'm not sure what value we can add.
No, it's just that they do have a good presence on BARCS now, and we should recognise it in some way.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you talked, well, because I suppose I fly F3F. If I took everything else that I did away and I just flew F3F, why would I join BARCS? Several things. One, the ability to sell stuff with F3F models on the forum is a fantastic conduit. And, you know, the decision we made that for a very small amount, you have to be a member of BARCS to be able to do that. I think that was absolutely the right thing to do. And a lot of the models that are sold on the forum are F3F models. So, you know, I think they get a lot of benefit from that. And then they use the forum extensively to publish all their competitions and write reports up, etc.
Yeah, yeah.
So I sort of I think in a way, it's almost a perfect sort of relationship. They feel that they've got control of it and autonomy, and they get the benefits of BARCS, and they are making a financial contribution to BARCS by a lot of them being members.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, it's just us recognising the fact that they are members. You know, just one of those things, isn't it? You know, we're all thermal soarers, but we've got a lot of soap soarers amongst us.
Well, perhaps what we should do is talk to the guys that are involved with it. So, you know, the John Edisons, the Mark Treble, Pete Gunning, these people, the guys that run all the competitions, and say, hey, you know, is there something more we can do for you? Yeah. I mean, have we got a glut of trophies, for instance? Do we want to dedicate a trophy to their Winter League championship? They have an event called the Champion of the Champions, which is at the end of March, which is normally in Wales. What they do is they have all these winter leagues for the different regions of the UK to cut the travel down. So they have a North, a South, a Midlands, and an East league. And then the top 3 or 4 pilots from each of those leagues they go and fly in the Champions of Champions. Now, you know, that's something maybe we could be looking to support that.
So if I can sort of butt in there a little bit, because I was around when we started up GBSRA.
You got experience, Simon. Yeah.
And Martin Newnham was both, you know, the main guy on the GBSRA, but he also sat on the BARCS committee, I think, at the time, to coordinate into the slope stuff. I'm not aware of any particular call from the F3F racers to ask any more out of BARCS. I think they're happy with the relationship, but it may be worth them, as you say, approaching some of the CD types, Joel West, Pete Gunning, people like that, just to see if there is anything else to do. But I'm not aware. I think they're quite happy with the way that runs, and I think they're quite happy with the sort of coordination with BARCS and what they get out of the forums and communications and so on. I don't think they're particularly calling out for anything else. I mean, the GBSRA itself has you know, a certain amount of funds which it uses to fund equipment, course equipment, and so on. So I don't think they're after money or anything particular.
Oh well, just a thought.
That was good.
I think it's worth I think it's a really comment well made, Pete. And if you don't talk to people, you don't get information, and then you don't find out that there is something we can do. So, you know, I know all those guys. I'll have a chat with them all and see what they say.
I think it's a perennial question, and certainly in the past there's been grumblings about BARCS being, you know, totally thermal focused and not anything else. I think it's more relaxed from that viewpoint these days, and I think you know, BARCS representation is pretty good. But if you look across all the different gliding disciplines, there's lots that are not necessarily covered in detail at BARCS, but are discussed a fair bit on the forums. And I think, you know, but there may be limited numbers of people doing it. And so the question is, you know, I think if people really want support and want something to be bigger, they'll probably voice that on the forums, and maybe, you know, BARCS should accommodate that if necessary. But I think people are generally happy with things. I mean, there's things like F5Ks coming along at the moment, and there are other radio controlled thermal soaring classes in Europe that maybe are not necessarily particularly popular here at the moment, but might become one day. And obviously there's things like the GPS triangle, which Greg himself, others on this call are doing as well, which I think has attracted quite a lot of interest. So we've just got to keep an eye on these different classes and see if help's needed to you know, bring them along.
I think, Pete, one of the things that's been really good, and you've been part of this, is with Austin, you know, if we get a new thing come along like F3K Res and GPS, we've created a place for them on the forum very, very quickly. You know, turn that around really quickly. And if you look at all the different specialisms that Simon's mentioned, they've all got a place on the forum, and there's traffic. I mean, traffic's not constant on any of the disciplines. You know, on F5K and F3F, there'll be a whole flurry of posts, and nothing will happen for a few weeks. It's the same with the Res and with the GPS. But, you know, I think we've been very proactive when something comes along. We've created an area for people, and I think they're using it. They're communicating on it. And, you know, I know on the GPS one, we get people from America and things come on asking questions. I think that's an absolutely brilliant thing that BARCS do. The forum is an incredible tool. Right. So thank you, Pete. I will have a chat with those guys, and I'll start with John Edison because he's sort of at the heart of running the competitions at the moment. I'll have a chat with him and see if there's more that we can do. But I will also talk to Mark and Pete Gunning and to Joel and some of these other people that Simon knows really well and just say, hey, is there any more that we could be doing for you? A very good point.
Okay.
Anybody, you got any other AOB?
You're doing the record, are you?
I am. I was going to leave it to last.
Right.
So here it is. So we had one application for, thank you for prompting me, Nick. I am getting pretty senile, so I do need prompting so often. We had one application for a BARCS record from Gary Binney, and he was successful in this 1 hour and 17 minute and 43 second flight for the ELG single thermal record. So Nick's produced a certificate, which is there, and that will be winging its way to Gary. So I think congratulations from BARCS to Gary for doing that. That's quite an achievement. So well done. Yeah. And then all I would say is thank you for taking the time to tune in. It's been really excellent with Sean. It's been the best AGM we've had for a while, I think. And I appreciate you guys making the time to come along and join us tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Yep. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you,
yeah,
Sean.
thanks everybody. It's a very good evening. And great to see you again, Sean.
Yes.
Happy landings.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas all.
Yeah. Goodbye.